Hello and welcome to the Subjective Space with me, Sindhu Rajasekaran. I'm so honored to welcome Dr. Rodge Glass to the Subjective Space. Hello, Rodge.
Hi, Sindhu.
So, Rodge is an award winning author and a senior lecturer at Strathclyde. He has published 8 books so far. His biography of Alasdair Gray won a Somerset Maugham Award for nonfiction, and his essay on the Covenant won the 2023 Anne Brown Essay Prize. Rodge's latest book of nonfiction is Joshua in the Sky, a Blood Memoir, published by Taproot Press, and we are going to be talking about that book. So, thank you so much for joining me, Rodge.
It's a pleasure. My idea of fun.
So let's talk about your book, Joshua in the Sky, which you've been promoting in the UK at the moment. You've been doing book tours and readings. So I read a recent interview that you did with Lindsay Johnstone for the Glasgow Review of Books, and something that she wrote about your book sort of, I thought, encapsulates it very nicely. So I wanted to read that out to you first before we get in. So she says its terrain is both corporeal and cerebral, rooted in the body and located in the darkest recesses of the psyche. It asks whether the lifelong stories we've been told to make sense of ourselves and the world have served us, and questions whether the coping mechanisms we adopt to get through our days in an increasingly senseless world detaches us from it or connects us to it. So I just wanted to ask you if you can tell us what Joshua in the Sky is about, essentially, and it's a biography memoir, so a little bit of what it's about and why you
Of
chose
course.
to write this book.
Sure. I can give you an overview of the book. But first of all, I think Lindsay's take is really good and she makes it sound very clever. But she's right about the body and the corporeal, and maybe we'll come back to some of that. And it is about trying to make sense of a senseless world. So it would be nice to return to that. But to give a few of the headlines first, I've often written nonfiction in the past. I've written biographies of others and always written about people who have had public lives, who've often been written about a lot before. But my attempt has been to get closer to those people or to portray them up close in a sensitive way. And usually I am a backgrounded part of that story. So I feel like I have experience of this kind of thing. But my attempt here is to write the biography of a short life, which otherwise would go unseen, which is the life of my nephew, Joshua, who lived for 3 hours after he was born in March 2017. And the book moves between biography and autobiography, so interleaving looking inwards at my own life and outwards at Joshua's life, linked through our rare blood condition, which is called HHT. HHT is a rare blood condition that about 1 in 10,000 people have. It goes across every race, culture, nation on Earth, and most people who have HHT don't know they have it. And that's important because I didn't for a long time know that I had it and didn't get diagnosed, and for quite a while until I was well into my adulthood. And none of us in the family realized that HHT could kill. And after Joshua died, I went through a period of a few years of very intensely turning over what had happened and why it had happened, and felt that Joshua's death was my responsibility. And so the book interleaves these reflective passages that are about my life, and also tries to ask the question, whose life gets to be remembered and how. And it works towards a final chapter, which is a mini biography, an attempt at writing a very short life. The other thing probably worth saying up front is that it's a story about the nature of the stories that we tell ourselves about our own lives and the lives of others, and how we frame a life, how we make sense of a life. And all of that is hiding inside the book, I suppose.
Thanks, Raj. I think one of the things that really struck me, and I've read you before, and the thing is how you sort of you talk about how you make sense of this. I just want to start with reading on the Covenant, the essay that won the award, which I read,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the first things that struck me about it was so tender but also humorous and it's so personal. But you're sort of it's about you attending the the Jewish bris ceremony for Joshua through Zoom, wasn't it? Through a screen, and about how this sort of, how you're contemplating all of these things while you're watching it, contemplating existence, Joshua's short life, about the tradition and ritual, about your own contradictory sort of conflicted relationship with the Jewish community, and all of that. So could you tell me why you chose to, write this book in such a way that you're mediating through, so let's say, literature or through art or all of these different things that why
Yeah.
that choice?
Yeah, there's a really good, simple answer for that, which is that I have always understood my own life through storytelling. I have two skills, reading and writing, and that's it. I'm not going to be able to uh, fix a TV or build a bed. What I can do is try and express thoughtfully what we might learn about the world in which we live through reading and writing. And up until Joshua's death, I had a huge amount of faith in the fact that storytelling was not this tangential, indulgent thing for people who were interested in art, but rather something that is like absolutely fundamental to the way that every society operates. There has never been any society that has got by without telling a story about itself or being surrounded by storytelling. And the modern world is more like that than it has ever been before. Now, I always had complete confidence in that and in the decisions that I'd made. Writing and reading had given me a living and a life that I was really pleased with and proud of. And then after Joshua died, all of that just seemed like a sick joke for a while. Like I had been occupying myself with this thing over here when I should have been paying attention to something that was really important that was over there. If that makes sense. And that was about like practicalities in and around HHT. And so my relationship with storytelling completely fell apart. Now, the reason this is an answer to your question is that I had to put that back together bit by bit. And I realized over time that actually I was being far too harsh, and that not only is storytelling a consolation to us in times of grief and trouble, but also it can help us understand and make sense of an otherwise senseless world. So, in trying to put the chapters together for this book, what I chose to do was to respond to a poem, a story, an artwork, a person, a speech for each chapter, and to make that a trigger to be able to write something that was interleaving my own life, dramas and mini scenes from that life, for example, and on the Covenant, and also interleave those with parts of Joshua's life and reflections leading up to the chapter about him. So on the Covenant, which is about Joshua's little brother, his bris ceremony, that was um, an opportunity to be able to use the speech that we all knew was coming as part of that service, which we all knew would mention Joshua, because how could it not? And to charge the story that I was trying to tell. In each of the chapters, I'm moving bit by bit towards facing what a biography of Joshua's life might look like. And if you're incrementally moving towards something and away from a kind of denial, you need a structure within which to do that. And my structure is to have a drama in the moment, to have the opportunity to step out of that drama and be reflective, but also to try and face something directly. And each of the chapters do that.
You do have a very, like, I love the way you write, like, how it's like very sparse, which you also said that, that it's a great way to write these things because it's so emotionally charged, it's so sentimental, but you don't want to, the way when you write it, you want to sort of connect to the reader, right, in a way that puts all of these emotions together, all these different ideas together, these imagined ideas of what it means to exist and what all of this makes. I mean, what sense does any of this make anyway? You did mention somewhere that you thought of structuring the book in the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, all of those things. So I think the next question I had for you was about when you said, how you the idea of storytelling had fallen apart for you in the beginning, and how you had to sort of piece it together little by little by, putting everything together. And I know you've run the Alasdair conference, the Gray conference, where it was called, making imagined objects, right? So this whole idea of nonfiction, in the sense being that it's not fiction and it's real, but what exactly is that real, or what how do you approach writing nonfiction in that sense, because we're all imaginary beings in that sense?
Yes, we are. We're all imaginary beings. You're right. And that we all have multiple versions of ourselves. And the version of me that's in Joshua in the Sky is a real version of me, but necessarily it cuts out a huge amount. And the ingredients that are left in the portrait that act in conversation with each other create something that is imagined. I mean, it has to work as a character on the page. How do I do that? Well, in a lot of my previous storytelling, I have made myself a character. In the Alasdair Gray biography, I was a sort of cheerful, butt of the jokes, sort of comic background presence, and my purpose was to serve the portraits of the main focus of the book, which was Alasdair. I've also written about my own children in nonfiction audio stories in the last year or two, and I'd written a book about Michel Faber as well. And in all of those cases, I was somewhere present in what I was doing. So I felt like I could carry that experience into this, knowing that you are both doing something that is imagined and also is true. So you cannot lie, but you have to accept that the minute that you put something onto the page, you are creating something imagined, and you have to be at peace with that, I think. For me, the difference this time was that I was much more vulnerable, and it was much more raw, and I was a large part of the focus for big sections of the book. So there's a different element of risk there, but I actually found that quite liberating, quite freeing to do. And this was a process that was, not just some minor side thing that I was doing for my own entertainment or to progress my career, but this was a mode of survival. And so having all of that experience of doing nonfiction portraiture in the past was an absolute gift to me this time, I think.
I think that's my next question for you, really, is that it's so difficult to write about somebody who you're related to, right? Like when you're writing about family. And also because in this case you both shared the HHT, and it's a blood it's a blood condition, and you're
Yeah.
connected to this person by blood. So how hard was it for you to write something that was so personal and yet to sort of be creative about it? Because I have friends who've lost babies or pregnancies, and it's been so, and these are writers who found it so hard to write about it for so many years because they cannot make a story, or they cannot make it the story.
Yeah. Yeah. The short answer is it was very difficult at the beginning and very easy come the end. But a lot of that wasn't really about me. It was partially about sort of building a meaningful, trusting relationship with Joshua's parents, and bit by bit, us all getting used to the idea that I was going to be writing about this. So I started without any expectation of publication at all, just as I say, as a mode of survival. I was completely consumed by guilt and didn't know what to do with that. And I did the only thing I know how to do, which is to try and write my way through it. But I was very shy about that at the beginning, and found being creative as well as truthful quite a difficult balancing act. But the way that I got through that was by sharing bits of it with Joshua's parents, and by saying, I know this is a bit strange, but this is what I'm doing. Is that okay? And getting their own blessing from it initially. And even in the worst of their own grief, I think they recognized that this was part of me working through my grief. And so they were very supportive of it. Then one chapter was published in a tiny little creative nonfiction journal that almost nobody read, but it was in print and they could get used to that. Then an extract was published in New Writing Scotland, and that was seen a little bit more. They were comfortable again, and so one chapter was published in Gutter, a version of it. And then on the Covenant chapter won the Anne Brown Prize, and that was available freely online. I think that was transformative because it meant that they could then choose to share that with other people in their lives instantly just by sending the link. You don't need to go and buy a literary magazine or anything. And all of these incremental changes made a practical difference, not only to us all getting used to the fact that it was happening, but it actually changed the writing as well. And it made me more at peace with the fact that this thing could be, unflinching at times and very, very dark at times, but also playful at times and experimental, and not only be about HHT and not only be about Joshua, but to sort of circle around Joshua until the final chapter in a way that was like respectful, clear, but also fits in with the rest of the work that I've done in the past.
I think something that you said in an interview. Can you hear my echo by any chance?
I can hear a tiny bit of
Okay, all right.
in a distracting way for me, but I love it.
I'm just going to cancel the echo just in case it's okay. All right. So I was just saying that something that you said in an interview about, how in the end of the book, Joshua's little sister cries out in joy that Joshua's in the sky. She's not learned to think of her big brother's death as tragic yet. It's not, or at least it's not only tragic. She exists as the person she is, literally and directly, because of Joshua's life. and what we all learn from it. Now, isn't that some kind of a magic trick, you say? Which I find very fascinating and beautiful, because that's the thing about short lives, right? You don't want those lives to be forgotten, and they're important lives too. So you don't want to think of these lives only through the sort of filter of tragedy or the lens of tragedy, but you also want to remember what you can. But when it's such a short life, and when you, I think you also spoke about how Alasdair Gray, how he inspired you to talk about whose lives deserve to be remembered and whose lives, all of that. So I just want to know, I want you to talk about a little bit about this, about how it's not only about the tragedy, and how it's important to look at these different aspects.
Yeah, I can talk about that. There's two elements there really. One is about the other non-fiction works that I have been inspired by that do something similar, presenting tragic stories in non-tragic ways, and I can give a few examples of those in a minute, of my favourites that really shaped Joshua in the Sky. But about there's also an element about the presentation of the book that matters too. So even before you get into the main book, the epigraph, there are two epigraphs, one from James Baldwin, which is about the value of reading, and the second one, which is from Joshua's mum, that says every bereaved parent's worst nightmare is that their child will be forgotten. And the act of making Joshua in the Sky literally prevents that from happening. Like, he cannot be forgotten because his name is in big letters on the front of a book that we can all own. Also, the way that we've chosen to design the book, bright colors, a rainbow, represent rainbow babies, but also something that is, that doesn't present itself as just purely tragedy. If the book had a sentimental or a very downbeat cover, I think it would be a very different kind of book. What we wanted was something that was bright and was like a portrait, that looked like it might belong in a modern art gallery, and that contained some kind of reference to blood and some reference to rainbows and sunshine after the rain and all of that, but that wasn't cheesy or sentimental, and which accepts tragedy but doesn't make tragedy the whole story. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, where have I found examples of other writers that have done this? Well, in Scotland, there have been two or three great examples of this recently, which helped me. I think for all of us as writers, you're looking for models of what others have done that you might be able to do in your own way. One was Michel Faber's book Undying, a love story, which even in the title, Undying, a love story, insists on bringing somebody back to life and insists on a particular kind of framing that talks about Michel Faber's wife, Ava, and they were together for 26 years. She died of cancer. But even as cancer kills her, he insists on refusing the framing that her death is tragic. What he insists upon is framing their life and their relationship together as upbeat, and talking about the value of their love. You could call it a story of dying or of death and of suffering, and he doesn't flinch from that suffering. But the choice that he makes in the presentation of the book, the title, the subtitle, what gets included and what gets cut out, is all about not hiding from tragedy, but also not letting tragedy become the whole story. So that's one example. There's also Michael Pedersen's Boyfriends, which was hugely successful, both sides of the Atlantic, which is about the suicide of Michael Pedersen's friend, Scott Hutchinson, who was in the band Frightened Rabbit. And rather than focusing on the suicide itself or on like anguish or guilt or blame or what could we have done, he chooses to celebrate that friendship in all its vividity and color and like great moments of closeness, and talking about the value of male friendship. So that too, in a very different way, is about like, not letting tragedy only be tragedy, and finally, Chitra Ramaswamy's Homelands, which is about her relationship with a 90-something-year-old Jewish man who came to Scotland on the Kinder transport, and looking at her own Indian immigrant family and looking across generations and across culture and across race, but doing it through storytelling. She uses W.J.G. Sebald a lot. Anyway, I think that being able to see examples of how other writers have done this, looking at tragedy, at grief, looking unflinchingly at difficult subjects, but not allowing them to only be tragedy, that was really, really important for me. And so moments like Joshua's little sister saying Joshua's in the sky, those moments become incredibly important, and they are part of his biography. They just happen to be out with the hours that he was actually.
You also spoke a little bit about Faber's, obsession with compassion, generosity, and connection, right? This sort of innate human desire to connect in some way. So how did that sort of influence you? You did speak a little bit about Faber. If you could elaborate a little bit more about how that played into when you wrote this book, because, like you said, it's just a few hours of his life, but how did you want to know more about that, or how did you want to?
Yeah, there's a really strong connection between my book about Michel Faber and Joshua in the Sky. And although the connection with Alasdair Gray has been commented on a lot more, and for some people in Scotland in particular, Alasdair's work might be better known. In fact, Michel is a much more popular writer internationally. And I was writing my book about Faber at the same time as I was drafting Joshua in the Sky. So I see those two in conversation with each other throughout. In order to write the book about Faber, I had to find a through line of the work because he has no comfort zone in genre or form, and the work is so incredibly diverse. And the thread that I found in the work when I pitched the book to the publisher was about readings of compassion or the absence of compassion across his stories, which is rooted in the fact that his parents were literally Nazi collaborators. In Holland, he grew up in a house of silence and shame, as he describes it. And a lot of his work is a response to that, an attempt to connect across that impossible human divide. What he'll often talk about is, and he mentions this in the introduction to the book Michel Faber Critical Essays that came out in 2020. He says that he's interested in our valiant attempts. I like that word a lot, valiant attempts to connect with others, even when, and sometimes especially when, that is almost impossible or impossible. And this became a preoccupation of mine because it was a time in my life where I needed to think about compassion and generosity. And in the years after Joshua's death, when I was struggling, trying to find a way through storytelling to understand what value compassion and generosity can have for us. All of that, these things were essential to me as a way of being able to get through day to day in the wake of Joshua's death. Again, it wasn't some kind of tangential or like minor thing in my life, it was essential. And so when I came to writing the sections about Joshua, Faber's work was very much in my mind. And I wanted to write in a way that was generous, compassionate, expansive, and inclusive. Storytelling allows us to imagine the lives and the worlds of other people in radically different times, cultures, races, genders, experience. Like we can jump over all kinds of barriers between us. Identity is essential. All of these elements that make us particular are essential, and to collapse them or to deny them, I think, is a terrible mistake. But that doesn't stop us from having anything in common. Right? And all of those elements in Faber's work, I wanted to transpose into my reading of Joshua's life. And so the decisions that I made about how to present Joshua's life are all very, very strongly influenced by Faber. There's a chapter on oxygen where I have an asthma attack and I'm on my way to the hospital. And I interleave that with discussions of Faber's work and how that led me to thinking about what kind of biography I could write of Joshua's life. And all of those things are underpinned by Faber's approach to compassion.
I think we live in such a divided world right now, and I think it's so important to talk about that sort of compassion, generosity, and, connecting on a very human level. I think we've even spoken about this with respect to my own work when you read it, and we are saying that I know the context is so different. Obviously, it's about a different culture or whatever, but at the end of the day, we're humans, and when we're reading something, we're looking for that human connection, right? So can you tell me about when when you're writing about like because this book is deeply rooted in Jewish culture. You're writing about a lot about that stuff. So when you're writing it for a sort of wider audience who are not Jewish, did you think consciously about how can I, maybe not dilute it, but maybe make it more approachable for everybody on a human basis to just connect with this short life?
Yeah, I think you've got to think about how to let people in. And so you're making decisions about what kind of language to use, um, the framing, I think, of any individual story. But so much about ancient religions is not really about that religion. It's about culture and community or family or tradition, which can be a straitjacket or can be liberating. I feel like the rule of the paintings of the Garden of Eden applies, by which I mean you don't have to be a believer in the Garden of Eden as a real, literal thing, or indeed even approve of elements of the story in order to be able to see its potential for universality. And I think that you don't need to dilute. You just need to be specific, but be specific in a way that is underpinned by a kind of openness. And so I feel like writing about the Jewish elements of the book were simpler than I initially thought that they would be. I thought that there would be all kinds of things that would push readers away in a sense. But in fact, the more that I did it, the more I realized it wasn't really about Judaism at all. It's about somebody who has got a conflicted relationship with the faith they were brought up with, which I do very much. And I basically run away from my Judaism or tried to pretend that I wasn't Jewish for about 25 years. And it's about somebody who's forced to come back to that faith in a limited way. And I think that story is pretty universal. The thing, for those that don't know the book, the thing that challenges me and that I think lets readers in is that because a lot of my own family have remained as part of that community and that faith in a way that I did not, I was forced to re-engage with it after Joshua's death because of religious ritual. And whether that was, being around the graveside at Joshua's funeral, being forced to listen to a rabbi's speech for the first time in years, or whether it's the circumcision ceremony, or whether it's an anniversary ceremony during COVID where you're online, but you're listening to what's happening in the community in a different place. Like all of these things, yes, okay, there are elements that are particular to that religion, but they're not really about that. A lot of ancient religions are helping us cope with the ultimate universal difficult things, which are the same now as they were 5,000 years ago. It's what is your community, who is your family, what are your guiding moral principles. And by being around, what's the best way for me to put this? Let me try again. Being at Joshua's graveside, listening to a rabbi try and sensitively, generously, inclusively make sense of Joshua's life, and his death, which seemed senseless to us at the time, that forced me to face my own prejudices and assumptions about a religion that I had turned kind of into a monster by disengaging from it for a long time. So it was quite a jolt to me to realize that I loved a rabbi. It was the last thing that I thought would ever happen. But it forced me to admit that things are always a lot more complicated than you think they are, that within any big faith, there is, a million different interpretations or possibilities for how to respond to that faith. And it made me go back to first principles in a way that I'd otherwise been able to avoid. And I really think that a lot of that isn't really specifically about Judaism or any individual faith. To return to the Garden of Eden, the story has to be specific to a place, but it can be universal to everybody. So, okay, I was at a circumcision ceremony feeling awkward and distant, and it was kind of comical, and I didn't really want to be there, but I wanted to be there, and it was emotional, and I was surrounded by things that were reminders of things that were difficult. A lot of that isn't really about Judaism at all. It's about how you try and accept who you are. And in writing Joshua in the Sky, I was trying to accept that Judaism isn't something that you can run away from. And I know that because I was trying to do it for a quarter of a century and people still saw it in me. So you have to come to some kind of acceptance. And in a way, that is one of the gifts of Joshua's life, is that without that, I wouldn't have had to face it.
I think now you mentioned Garden of Eden, so that reminded me of Alasdair Gray's painting. I think 7 Days After Creation or something like that it was called. So I want you to talk a little bit about Gray next and about how Gray, because Alasdair Gray is, like you said, such a big part of Glaswegian culture, and you sort of introduced me to Gray. So I've read Gray, and seen all the paintings and all of that. So I know that Oranmore Auditorium, you also respond to that in the book, right? So can you tell me how that fits in, and how Gray's work, and you knowing him personally and writing his biography, how all of that played into the book?
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you asked that, because in a way, the book about Joshua contains all of these other stories that I've previously told as well, and reflects on those, in that I'm trying to learn something from my experience about writing of other people, and then carry that learning into the way that I write about Joshua. So there's an essential early chapter in the book which is set in the Oranmore Auditorium, which is the biggest free to access artwork in Scotland, that contains um, uh, a black Adam and a white Eve embracing, looking up at the sky, with Mother Nature and the entirety of the cosmos mixed in with ordinary Glaswegians. And during the pandemic, I had to give a reading from Alasdair's work on camera in that space, which seemed kind of ghostly. And it was not long after Alasdair died. I was his secretary when I was a young man, and then I wrote his biography in this way, where I was this backgrounded Boswell kind of character. And at the time, I was really young. I was really earnest. I meant well, but I didn't know a great deal. I think I was good at portraying him in certain ways, but I didn't have a deep understanding of the work. And I've spent many years building an understanding of that since. Anyway, so I used those scenes of the Oranmore as a way to, 15 years later, return to how writing about Alasdair has transformed my own life. It's had a huge impact on my adult life. It's been like the transformative incident of my, not incident, what's the best way to put it? The transformative experience of my adult literary life. And so I portray these scenes where I'm in the Oranmore, also later when I'm reflecting on times where I was with Alasdair in the Oranmore, many years after my biography was published. And what I'm trying to do there is to use those scenes to try and explore, what have I learned about writing about lives, and how can I use that in order to write about Joshua, to do something that's useful, rather than just to anguish and to feel bad and to feel guilty, which ultimately is understandable for a while, but is a waste of time and energy and doesn't help anybody. So the process of being able to look back on my experiences with Alasdair as a young man, and the ways that has informed and enhanced my life since, those things had a huge impact on the way that I then decided to write about Joshua.
I think we're almost drawing to the end of the 45-minute mark. So I think the last question I did have for you was to do with, you know, you've been doing like a book tour of Joshua and the Sky. We spoke about this briefly before we started recording, and about how when you're doing readings and when you're sort of interacting with people, how has that been? Because it's such a difficult book to, when you're doing book promotions in general, you're just sort of going out there and just sort of, but when it's such an emotional and very deeply personal book to you, how has your experience been in sort of talking about it with the reading community, and how have people responded?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, there've been certain things that have surprised me. I think I've realized, the more that I've done, the more that I've realized that, although yes, it's about Joshua, for people that come along to the event, it's not necessarily about Joshua, or even about, it's definitely not about HHT. It's about grief and how we understand the lives of others and how we memorialize. My book is essentially a memorial to somebody I love, and who I never met. And I find that people reveal a lot about themselves at the events. And a large part of my job is to be there to listen to what other people have to say, I think, about their own experiences. That's been really staggering. And the book is published by a really small publisher. And I had quite low expectations for how far I thought it would reach. And it's been really lovely to see that actually it's exceeded those by some distance. But part of the way it's exceeded those has really surprised me. So people will come up to me after the events and tell me about people that they've lost, or say that they had a child that died and they haven't mentioned their name for years and years, or they might just want to share something with me about something of their experience of grief. because essentially what you're doing is not really promoting a book. You're talking about a way of remembering and giving people permission to feel that it's okay to talk about those things. And the longer that the events have gone on, and the more different kinds of things that I've done, the more I've found that that has been the thing that's united them all. And that also I consider to be a gift from Joshua. You know, every single one of these things that I do, they're gifts from Joshua. And some of those are obvious, but some of those are more surprising, and are quiet or would otherwise go unseen. And that's something I'm really, really
I mean, I
grateful for.
must mention to those listening that the award money that you got from the Unbound Prize, you donated to the charity which does research in HHT, right?
Yeah, and it's the same for all the author profits and all of the events and the appearances that I'm doing. Yeah. They're all going to Cure HHT, which is the research center based in Chicago, and also the UCLH fetal unit, which is the unit that cared for Joshua. And all of that is portrayed in the book as well, with the support and collaboration of Joshua's parents.
So can you also tell us about what Joshua's parents, how have they, their journey in all of this, and how have they participated when the book has come out?
Yeah, I think there's no denying that it's difficult for them, but they're very supportive, very generous. They don't have to get involved in like every little thing that I'm doing, but I selectively include them and share photographs from the events and things like that. I was at a bookshop and took a photograph of the book table that had loads of copies of Joshua last week, and that was nice for them. I think it's best that they don't have to feel like they have to be present at lots of these things, and they are remaining anonymous. But next week we're doing an event in London that's invite only that they can be at, and I think that will be the best kind of emotional.
Okay. I mean, we still have 10 minutes, so I have two more questions for you, which I thought of.
Sure, of
Yeah.
course, yeah,
So one
yeah,
was to do with, the sort of corporeal or body aspect of it, right? Or with blood, the body.
yes,
Because you yourself have these, you yourself suffer from, the same disorder or issue. So how hard was it for you to write that? Because when you're writing about these things, you're physically sort of, how it feels. You're not imagining it. It's not imaginary. So
yeah.
how hard was that?
Honestly, very hard, but totally liberating. Like for years and years and years, I'd had um, a lot of these symptoms and felt either ashamed of them or like I couldn't talk about them or I didn't understand them. And this gave me a way to be able to talk about it in a way that came very naturally to me because I've been living with it for years and years. But also, I felt like there was a reason to do it, and that was a worthwhile reason. So, this is maybe a good time to talk about the subtitle of the book. So, it's called Joshua in the Sky, A Blood Memoir. And I like a title of a book that has a subtitle with a question hiding inside it. So, we all know what a memoir is, right? But what is a blood memoir? And in this case, a blood memoir is something that ties you through blood to your family, but also literally ties me to my mum, to one of my own children, to my brother, to Joshua through the blood condition HHT. And there has been no book published in Europe about HHT, full stop. Like there is nothing. So this was an opportunity to be able to write something about this condition and the experience of having the condition where I felt I could be useful and I could do it in a visceral way that was like hard and uncomfortable, but was also genuinely liberating, because it felt like I was doing something that was worthwhile. And whether that is, portraying what an HHT episode is actually like, which is how the book starts, or whether it's kind of reflecting on the strangeness of HHT, which is that it sort of tricks you into thinking it's nothing really. And then the consequences of it can hit you all the harder. All of that to me felt like a mixture of something that was almost impossible to do, but also came very naturally. I realize that's a contradiction, but it felt like both of those things were true at the same time. And because there is no book about the experience of having HHT, that made it seem all the more worthwhile.
You've also recorded this as an audiobook, right? Joshua
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
Sky. So it's just you reading out the whole book.
Yeah. I mean, we did consider doing it another way and somebody else reading it on my behalf, but it just seems like such a personal book that, and also it's very much in my voice. You read the book and it's the same as the way I speak. um, So I got a lot of selfish pleasure out of doing it. I really got a lot out of the process. Again, it was what I would call the best kind of emotional. I had to keep stopping, and I would get teary, and I'm very soft, and so I get emotional. But I'm really glad that we have an audio book version of it as well. And I think there's something about the audio form that's genuinely intimate, and I embrace that. I really, really like the fact that you can be almost whispering in somebody's ear, and that is a way of bringing them close to the story. It also means that the book can find lots more people than otherwise it would do. The audiobook is going to be out in the next couple of weeks, and I'll share it when it is. But I'm really excited
I
about it.
think a lot of younger folk, younger than me, like in their 20s or teenagers, they just listen to books. it is it is
Yeah,
bizarre for me
yeah,
because I do not understand. I still cannot do audiobooks. I still have to read it. Like I cannot listen,
right.
People just walk, run, read, listen while they're doing other things. But anyway, but yeah, I think your audiobook would be great because the way you write is very conversational. Like I can hear your voice in my head when I'm reading it. So thank you so much, Raj. I think I was able to ask you all the questions that I said I would ask you, and I think you really gave a
Great.
good, you made us understand what the book is about. So thank you so much, and I'm so honored to have you here again.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Cindy, for having me on your podcast.